Abdullah Verachia is a faculty member at Gibs. He's with us to discuss more about what happened last week. Well, Miller's got to put the smiley face onto it. He always is very good at promoting South Africa's brand. But given recent developments, let's just keep the development side out on the one hand. On the political side, being a member of BRICs is all of a sudden not such a happy place to be.
Sure. Good afternoon, Alec, and thanks for the invitation. I think there's a number of developments that have taken place recently, especially politically, and I think this obviously reflects the very different nature that these BRICS countries have, and you've got countries that are ideologically different, politically different political systems, and now coming together in a grouping and doing it, I think, as a creature of convenience. And so in the BRICS summits that I've been to, what I've seen is that the BRICS heads of state and the ministers of finance and even the business leaders tend to play within the swings that are familiar with them in the playground and tend to shy away from any of the contentious issues. And so you see the discussion that took place in Fortaleza last week was centered around three specific issues: around the new development bank, around the contingency reserve arrangement, and then around discussions and engagements between the export development agencies. And there was then a lot of hot air and discussions around various issues, from Syria to Palestine to the relationship with the United States of America, the new and developed world. But it was very much statements, and there was nothing concrete. And I think that reflects the nature of this BRICS grouping. The fact
but it is interesting because O'Neill, when he called it BRICS in the first place, he was just talking about 4 countries, and then South Africa got involved as well. So it's really 5 countries, and as you say, with very diverse cultures, diverse backgrounds, diverse agendas on a political sense, but on an economic sense, is it a good place to be, for us to be in there?
Well, I think, of course, I think South Africa's role in the BRICS is critical in terms of advancing the African agenda. And there was quite a bit of discussion and heated debate, as you've seen from Nozipo's interview with Miller, around the initial response from South Africa. And in Durban last year, South Africa thought that we're definitely going to get the headquarters of this bank. And I think 12 months later, we realized the different political and economic interests that all of the BRICS countries bring to the table. So this decision around this new development bank was actually taken in Delhi in 2012. It's taken 2 years for the 5 countries to come to some sort of consensus in terms of finality on this development bank. And the reason for that was because there was uncertainty in terms of where the bank would be headquartered and the mechanization of this bank. And I said the other day that it's not as if Cinderella put on a shoe at midnight in Fortaleza and this development bank is now reality. It's going to take another 2 to 3 years for this bank to come into fruition. And that's going to be a tough time in those 3 years as the finance ministers who form part of this technical task team come together and try and find some common ground in terms of the focus of the bank, where the bank will finance and the type of projects that it will finance.
And more importantly, how it's going to be funded. Because the feedback we got from Fortaleza was that all 5 of the countries are going to be putting in $2 billion a year for the next 7 years.
Correct.
Now, China has got, well, infinitely more reserves than we have, because we have negative and they, well, we don't have negative, but we have negative debt. They, of course, don't have debt at all. For South Africa to be putting in 140 billion rand, that's like 1 whole year's company taxes gone into the development bank as a shareholding. Those are big numbers for us to be coughing up for a small country.
Sure, 100%. I think in comparison to China, as you rightly say, it's pocket change for China, but South Africa, it's a key part of our GDP and a sizable contribution from our GDP every year for the next 7 years. But I think it's a bold move from South Africa. And the reason I say that is whenever you've got the creation and the formation of a multilateral institution, whether it was 1945, the formation of the United Nations, or the initial formation of the World Bank and the IMF, that initial formation and ensuring that you've got an equal say at the dinner table is very important. And South Africa's played quite a critical role in terms of elevating itself and putting up the requisite initial capitalization of that bank to ensure that we have equilibrium in terms of the say of that bank and the decision making of that bank. And so we've got equilibrium in terms of the initial shareholding of that bank. And I think that's important because as we go down the line and as we see this increase in terms of the role of the BRICS and the importance of the new development bank, we'll always have that equilibrium that was initiated from the start.
I get you, but in the IMF, for instance, the contributions that you make to the IMF and to the World Bank are in proportion to your GDP. Yeah. The Chinese are many times the contribution that South Africa makes there.
Sure.
In this instance, what are the benefits What is the tangible benefit of what's going to be a massive sacrifice for this country? I mean, 20 billion, that will give us a national health insurance.
Sure. I think the tangible benefits are multifold. I think the one is, I appreciate the fact that South Africa negotiated hard for this regional headquarters. And there was a strong push between China and India in terms of Delhi versus Shanghai as the headquarters. South Africa was never in the running in terms of that headquarters.
So why did Rob Davies think we were? And Zuma thought we were as well?
Well, I think there was a view. There was a strong push from the South African government in terms of trying to put Johannesburg as a convenient, independent, quasi-independent country where we could actually play quite a key role in terms of utilizing Johannesburg as a headquarters for the development bank. I think there was a strong push as well from Delhi and from Beijing.
And what is this development center? Is there going to be another one in the subcontinent? Is there going to be another one in Asia? Or is it just in South Africa? Do we serve parts of the world from Johannesburg?
No. I think the regional centre is specifically focused on infrastructure and green energy projects in Africa. And I think it gives us the opportunity to put Africa on the agenda, firstly. And secondly, to really start having engagements with some of the other development banks here, the Development Bank of South Africa, the AFDB, in terms of co-financing projects.
Is this going to be bigger than the African Development Bank? Or indeed, in time, is it going to be more useful to Africa than the IMF and the World Bank?
Well, I think in time it's definitely going to be a much larger institution. And I think the impact that the new development bank will have is that it obviously creates a much more safer environment for other private lending institutions to go and co-finance projects. It gives that requisite comfort to a number of private lending institutions. And I think that's where this new development bank has a much bigger influence than the $50 or $100 billion corpus that's been initially put together. It provides an opportunity for co-financing of infrastructure projects in a number of the BRICS countries and also beyond the BRICS countries. And that's the agenda going forward, is that as the corpus grows, the opportunity for financing projects beyond the BRICS countries will definitely be there. And so South Africa...
the obvious question, because we are running out of time, is will South Africa get more than the 140 billion rand that it's going to be putting in over the next 7 years? In other words, had we just taken that 140 and invested in our own infrastructure, will that be less than the way we can leverage this up in the new BRICS Bank?
Sure. I think there are obviously positives and negatives to a size of contribution that we've put together. The positives for me are multifold. I think one, we often speak about this lack of inter-regional trade in Africa, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. And it's as a consequence of very limited infrastructure on the continent. And so this BRICS Development Bank, given the fact that the sectoral focus will be on infrastructure developments, and secondly, given the fact that we'll have a regional center here in Johannesburg, gives us an opportunity to ensure that we tie up some of the infrastructure development opportunities that have been identified at NEPAD and the African Union to the financing that the new development bank will put together. And so as we get infrastructure developments off the ground and we get the requisite financing, that opens up opportunities for South African companies who find it a huge challenge to be able to transport goods and services. And so infrastructure unlocks economic opportunities, and I think that's the benefit.
No doubt, but let's hope that we get a good bang for our 140 billion, because it's a lot of money, and I don't know if that penny has quite dropped yet. But Abdullah Verachia is with Gibs, a faculty member at the Gordon Institute of Business Science, South Africa's leading business school, depending on which survey you look at, of course. There's a recent one that says UCT got ahead of them, but on the Financial Times survey, Gibs is #1.